Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Welcome back to the Ask Historians Podcast. I'm user SteelCan909 here with the second part of our discussion on the history of London, joined once again by Saul from the History of London podcast. And I'll go ahead and get right to it. We left off talking about medieval London on the eve of the Norman Conquest, the situation right before William shows up and it all goes to hell in a handbasket for a few decades. Can you tell us a little bit about what was the situation in London right before, we're talking 1065, Edward the Confessor getting up in years, not quite dead yet. What sets London apart besides its size compared to the rest of England?
I think the thing that genuinely set London aside was that it was, in many ways, far more than Winchester. It was the home of the Anglo-Danish faction that Godwin of Wessex had established within the English state. So you had, it was the base of the English fleets. Now, during the early part of Edward the Confessor's reign, when he's kind of ruling hand in hand with Godwin, and they sort of made this alliance, it's often overlooked how powerful England's navy was. Or navies, there were multiple navies going on. You had the holdover from Canute's invasion, which Arthur Canute had added to, which was roughly 90 Viking ships and crews based in London, living in the region we now call Lambeth and Southwark. And there they had their winter bases, the winter homes of the ships. So they were based there. They were the landsmen of London, and they had been involved in politics. They had chosen King Harold I over Arthur Canute. They had then backed Arthur Canute, but Arthur Canute didn't entirely trust them, so he brought over 40 of his own ships to build it up to 90. And the ongoing expenditure of this had been effectively a Danegeld every year upon the state of England as they paid for it. So you had this powerful fleet that Edward actually paid off and got rid of. But underneath it was one of the most overlooked weapons of Edward's state, which was the ship's fjord. Alfred had invented the fjord of London, the idea that every man of fighting age could and should serve a certain amount of time in the armed forces and could be mobilized. And this was an incredibly powerful, effective fighting force. Under originally St. Dunstan, and then developing in the reign of Edgar, a secondary system was set up, the ship's fjord, which was effectively a system of counties paid for and maintained ships that could be maintained, that went out and defended England on the seas. And this was based in London, in Lambeth. And we'd seen, even with the Viking fleet or the mercenary Danish fleet paid off to go back, there was still a lot of Anglo-Danes living in London. I mean, it could get really into detail about, we see that, sometimes if somebody from Warwick, a thane from Warwick was paying for a ship and paying the hides to maintain a ship from Warwickshire, he wouldn't necessarily send men from Warwickshire to man it, but he'd send the costs. And these costs would be done to pay for crews from somewhere like London. So there was a strong maritime community based there. And during Edward's reign, they had, they'd been doing joint operations in the Irish Sea and the North Sea. It was a powerful force. So that was the first thing that differentiated London from everywhere else. It had built upon its reputation as being this ferocious bastion against the Vikings. and as such had become this stronghold of now the Anglo-Danes. Added to that, it's easy to forget that Edward the Confessor was not really Anglo-Saxon, he was Anglo-Norman, and he had brought with him a whole bunch of Normans who were supporting him. And you saw that in the likes of the Archbishop of London. The Bishop of London was a Norman, and London was fine with that, and the Archbishop of Canterbury eventually became Lanfranc. But you had this idea that you had this meeting together of the Normans, the Saxons, the Danes, all smushing together within London, which made it different from anywhere else. So this was a city that was working on multiple levels, but working within the administration of their king Edward, and they were very loyal. They were very keen on him and on the status quo. And so that was the situation as he was coming in. And one of the things it's one of the things I point out about London at this period, and the issue with 1066 is it still causes so much debate, and historians get very passionate and they always pick a side. But it is worth saying that in 1065, the line of succession was very clear. Everybody in London knew what would happen in the event of the death of Edward the Confessor. His nephew Edgar the Aetheling was to take over, and Edith Godwinson was to be regent. That was the agreed established status quo as we go into the winter of 1065, where Edward is suffering from a series of strokes. He's definitely sickening, and that Christmas, the nobility of England all come to Westminster for the consecration of his new Abbey Church and Grand Mausoleum, which is to become Westminster, the Abbey Church of St. Peter's, which he was building as a grand mausoleum for his dynasty. This is one of the reasons why we know Edgar was meant to be this he committed all of this based on what he'd seen at the cathedrals over in Spire. He wanted a grand mausoleum for the ruling dynasty, his dynasty. So going into 1066 and 1065, it's a city that is very sure of itself. It's trading well. It has good relations with everybody. There is peace with Normandy, with Flanders, with Boulogne, with Denmark, with Norway, with Scotland. It's an entrepot. Everything's going great. And then it all goes very wrong on January 6th.
I was about to say, so one thing I did want to ask is, what is the source base that you're using for a lot of this stuff? Because some of the detail that you're going into here, for example, the location of these various ships and so on, the hidesmen are being paid by people from Warwick, the royal succession dispute, however you want to describe it. A lot of this doesn't really seem to get mentioned in some of the more broad survey histories of the time period. I'll admit myself, I'm not very familiar with it. My area being mostly legal history, though, so it kind of makes sense that I'm not super familiar with it. Where is this source base coming from?
Right. I got into a lot of this, which opened up a lot of the Saxon period. Looking at the original general survey that got me into it was when I was reading the naval history of England by Rogers. I think it's Safeguard of the Sea. And he goes into describing the nature of Dunstan's reform to set up the ship's fjord in particular, and how that set up. And then when you start studying specifically documents relating to the ship's fjord, you start seeing that under Dunstan, it had started in the abbeys and had sort of spread until by Edgar's time it was instituted. It then fell into remission and sort of fell apart. And you clearly see when Edgar dies and the squabbles between the nobility of England, the Anglo-Saxon Thanes start fighting each other during the disturbances towards Ethelred's reign, you can actually see the moment that the Vikings and the Irish start attacking again. So it's about comparing the historical records from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with Welsh, Scottish, and Irish records to start picking up what the Vikings were up to, or the Norse Gaels were doing. But then it's looking at the records for the ship's fjord, because we know that we have, I think you start looking at some of the crew records and you start seeing there's like captains of ships and they're located in landlocked counties and you're wondering how did they get there. And when you start looking at more specialist histories of seafarers and that kind of stuff, you start seeing that, you know, the Anglo-Saxon state was infused by an understanding of sea travel and the sea, because they'd just spent generations fighting sea-based Vikings. When it comes to the situation with Edward and Alfred and Edward and William and Godwinson and everything like that, the position I came to was based on looking at primary sources and also making discoveries that kind of surprise us. Like I did read, and I'm sure there are historians out there who will counter me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that none of the witness rolls from the 1060s exist without editing. That editing was done soon after. Names were removed from the witness rolls, all of them, as far as I can tell. The idea that Edgar Atheling was meant to be king is reinforced basically that there are three kind of very strong bits of evidence, one minor and two strong. The first one is, even though the closed rolls, the witness rolls have been all doctored, probably by Godwinson, to be honest, because I don't think William would have been too bothered by that. You see the moment, I'm pretty sure it was the consecration of Westminster itself. There's this amazing moment where the consecration of Westminster Abbey, the king turned up with his queen and with his heir, Edgar, and they were noted to come as a unit. And it's just noticeable that the last time you'd seen king, queen, heir go as a unit had been Canute going with his Norman second wife and Arthur Canute to a similar ceremony, I think in Bremen, or it could be Cologne. And it was a symbolic representation. This is my heir. For me, it's the aftermath and the circumstances of Godwinson taking the throne that really denotes to me that there were some shenanigans. And I say this without taking a side, the plague in all their houses, you know. But if you look very carefully at the actual sequence of events, the idea that Edgar would be king and Edith was to be regent wasn't that far removed from what was going on in France at the time, where there'd just been a regency where a queen had ran France for a young boy king. Holy Roman Emperor had just been a boy with a queen regent. So this was not an idea outside of the pocket. And most importantly, it was the two things that kind of trigger that this was not meant to happen. The first being that Godwinson had to be crowned on the 26th. He had no choice. Edward the Confessor died on the evening of the 25th of January. Godwinson had to be crowned, not on the 6th, sorry, on the 5th of January. He had to be crowned on the 6th of January. And why? Because that was 12th night. It was the last day of Christmas. And little known fact, Anglo-Saxon kings could only receive the crown during the major religious ceremonies, be it Christmas or Easter. And that's why, for example, Edward the Confessor had been crowned on Easter Sunday, that you could only be crowned during those specific time windows. And for Godwinson's legitimacy, if he had not have been crowned on Twelfth Night, he then could not have been crowned until the following Easter. And I think he needed the coronation to secure what was effectively a usurpation. And then the second issue that kind of shows this was a usurpation was the fact that there was no tension, no hint of warfare between Edward's state and any of their neighbours, and no sooner had Godwinson got the crown on his head, which still stands, by the way, as the fastest coronation in the history of this land, in the history of England. Edward the Confessor was buried in the morning, and Godwinson got this crown on his head in the afternoon. Even Henry II, who held one of the fastest coronations ever, which because he was going for Henry I, because he was going very quickly to make sure he could claim the throne over his brother in Normandy. Even he waited 3 days. Godwinson had to do it on the same day. Nobody has ever matched that. And then immediately afterwards, the second word gets out of England that Godwinson is king, suddenly Normandy, Flanders, Boulogne, Denmark, Scotland, Norway, and the Pope are all up in arms and willing to back military action against him. Something tells me that.
I was going to ask, how much do you think of that as a factor of opportunism, given the fact that the Godwins were, while a very important family in southern England in particular, they were not exactly politically stable. Godwin himself, referring to Harold Godwinson to differentiate between him and Godwin, Godwin did a stint of exile, as I recall, and several of their relatives ended up not staying in England for obvious reasons later on. How much of that response then is just opportunism? For example, and my knowledge of this era in terms of historical personages is not great. But if we're just going to take an example, Harold Hardrada doesn't strike me as a man who was particularly concerned about the niceties of succession. To put it bluntly.
I think it was just opportunism. I think Harold Godwinson never saw the big picture. From studying, the strangest thing is when you study English history through the filter of London's history, you do take on board kind of London's point of view. And one of the things you get from looking at Godwinson is that he never saw the big picture, ever. He does come across as a middle management who had delusions of grandeur. Many of his policies failed. The 1060s is a litany of some successes, but an awful lot of failures. The 1060s is a litany of invasions. I mean, his fights against the Earl of Mercia twice. He exiled the Earl of Mercia, and twice the Earl of Mercia sailed into Ireland, picked up a bunch of Vikings as mercenaries, and sailed into England and kicked Harold's ass. Admittedly helped by the Welsh, and then he goes after the Welsh and unleashes a genocidal campaign there by all accounts. And he was in the situation where people say, oh, the Witenagemot picked Godwinson. I mean, think about it. What was the Witenagemot at that point? They were either all surnamed Godwinson, or you had two teenage boys who were the Earls of Northumberland and Mercia. The oldest was 15. And then you had the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a heretic because the Pope did not recognize, he was excommunicated, because the Pope did not recognize him because he was Godwinson's chosen stooge. So it was a very easy choice to put him in charge. And it's worth noting that his, as much as I sound like I'm anti-Godwinson, it made sense to him at the time. And you know what? He actually did in his brief time. He showed he could rise to the occasion. He pacified the North, which was pretty amazing. But it's an idea. He didn't have any support. He had to go personally to the North and pacify the Northerners that he was king. because he'd kicked out Tostig, which had pleased them, put in this teenage boy to run them, and now he's going to the north saying, "I'm king." And it is worth remembering because he died, because he was crowned so quickly. As news of Edward the Confessor's death spread out, so did news of the coronation. Edward the Confessor had spent a year after he became king before he got his coronation. Edgar spent 30 years. So, it was an unusual event. He did that. And this ties into what happened in 1066, because you can see he had a good game plan to deal with William. He really did. And I will give him his due. The battle plan of Harold ties into what we were saying about the ship's feud perfectly, because the moment he knew William was coming, he utilized the tactic he had used in Northumbria against his brother. He had used in Wales brilliantly, and that was using the ship's feud to do a pincer attack. He raised the feud on the southern coast of England, and they were to sit there on the coast and wait for William to turn up. But the mainstay of the feud was the ship's feud, who sailed from London to the Isle of Wight and sat with the ship's feud in the Isle of Wight. And the plan was, when William invaded, the feud on the land wasn't to stop him, they were just to hold him in place. And then doing what he'd done in Wales, the pincer attack, bring the ships in around him, cut William off, wipe him out. He'd proven he could do this. It's how the Earl of Mercia had beaten him, doing the same, using the Welsh and the Vikings as a ship force coming in around him. And, we're pretty sure the second defeat of Godwinson was so horrendous that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle came out with the greatest one-liner to try and cover up his shame with, events were, quote, too tedious to relate, unquote. So, he knew the tactic. And I think if William had have gone earlier, William would have succeeded, wouldn't have succeeded. I think Godwinson had his measure with that tactic. Problem was, the weather didn't work out. The feud sat and went beyond their supposed time to be in the field, and eventually had to dismiss it and the ship's feud. And then news came that Hardrada had turned up. And so we run into that event with him having to go north, and then William does turn up. And, he has to raise the feud again and raise the ship's feud again. If you look at the geography of what William did, William went to Hastings because there was a monastery in Normandy they didn't own it. There was an abbey and there was a chapter house of the abbey in the Hastings region, and they knew the land. And William knew exactly where he was going, because if you look at where he ended, it's not where he landed. He moved to this location because there are rivers on either side, and it gave him a defensive position. His problem was when he did turn up, summer was over. The grass had stopped growing. They couldn't feed his horses. He needed to break out. Harold was coming south. He was trying to build up. He summoned the ship's feud, and he realized that William was going to break out sooner than he wanted. So he had to, and this is why two versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle make a note that he left before all his men were gathered, all his men being the ship's feud. And then he moved himself to Hastings for the battle to try and contain him. I doubt at that point, based on the weather, if the ship's feud could have sailed. William was very nervous about it because we know he reinforced the rear of his position, expecting a sea-based attack. And then the Battle of Hastings happened, and Harold died. Him and his brothers hacked apart. And then William dumped his body in the sea to make sure nobody could, venerate it. He was angry. But
okay, where does the story about the sea come from? Because I've never heard that version. I've always
heard
that he was buried in a local.
That's from one of the accounts. There's an account that his mother put into his mother requested of William. This is Harold's mother, or a relative, or maybe his wife, a female relative requested the body, and the body could not be given. And there was, there's talks about his body was found, and there's one point somebody said he survived the battle. Lots of myths came up on it, but we're pretty sure, based on the mutilations, that they dumped his body in the sea because he didn't want to give a body, and there's no contemporary account of a body being found. There is some later, but not at the time. But the thing that then happens is William hasn't won. He's just won a battle. The rest of England stands against him, and this is where London comes into it again. Because William moves up the coast, gets as far as Dover, gets malaria, spends a couple of months being poorly. What happens in the rest of the country? Well, we know that one man from London, a very important figure in London at the time, called Ansgar the Staller. He's the port reeve of London. He's Anglo-Dane. He was badly injured in Hastings by all accounts, but he survived. And Ansgar returns to London, where the ship's fjord is still gathering and the army is still gathering. And he organizes them. He takes over. And there's a real impression that it's Ansgar who turns round and says, right, Godwinson's dead, so are his brothers. We need a king. Turns to the Withangamot and says, we choose Edgar, correct? And Edwin and Morcar promptly make sure their sister is away from the Godwinsons and out of London, and then they say yes. And then in that brief phony war period where William can't pursue the campaign because he's poorly, London does what it did during the Viking era. It becomes a bastion of resistance, and it builds up its forces, it builds up its defences. And Ansgar clearly recognises that if William is going to try to prosecute his campaign, he has to cross the Thames. And from where he is in Kent, the first and main crossing is London Bridge. And that leads to the second big battle of 1066, the Battle of Southwark, the Battle of London Bridge, where William is not there, but his vanguard of knights goes screaming into Southwark to take London Bridge and fail. And they're beaten off. And they cannot cross London Bridge. What they do is they burn down Southwark. And for example, we know this was not a small burning. The Royal Mint that had been, I remember saying in the last part that London was unique because it had two mints, one over in the city and one across the bridge in Southwark. The Royal Mint in Southwark is destroyed. It doesn't work again for years. And I think, again, then this ties into a question you asked earlier about the hard evidence of the fleets. We see reference to there being a large Danish fleet here. I will make it clear to all the listeners that the idea of there being winter houses, the basis of the ship's fjord, we have no physical evidence. This is a theory put forward by me based on reading the documentary evidence and looking at where did they store the ships, given the population of the Danish fleet that was there. Where did they sit? So I will say that, and for me, one of the reasons we don't find it is the complete annihilation of Southwark after that battle. Lambeth and Southwark were taken out by the Normans, but they could not cross the river. Ansgar defeated the Normans. Subsequently, William did manage to find a compliant Saxon to let him cross the river, split his forces in two, forces collapsed. Meanwhile, over the river, Edgar was king. He was dealing with business. We only have the case of one particular abbot sent to him to request something, or an abbey sent to him to request for the appointment of an abbot, as you would a king. A lot of people make a big thing, well, he didn't get his coronation, but remember, you couldn't get your coronation until one of the major religious festivals. And I believe, Edgar was due to be have the crown put on his head round about Christmas Day, 1066, the same day that William did, basically. Um, and effectively, what happened was William circled London. The Saxons just went, okay, we give Ansgar and Edgar, and everybody went out. They said, we surrender. And they accepted William. And William walked in, and then, got crowned on Christmas Day, 1066. And then his men, who were busy looting Westminster at the time, got a little carried away and set fire to it all. And so Westminster Island burnt while the king's getting his crown put on his head. Fantastic start, really.
Well, it sets the tone for the rest of William's reign, doesn't it? When we're looking at the subsequent aftermath of the Norman conquest on England, most of, especially survey histories, tend to look away from London for a lot of this. You've got things like the harrying of the North. You've got the somewhat legendary, somewhat supported, I don't want to say exodus, but at least some migration happening out of England to places like the Byzantine Empire and so on, where famously the Varangian Guard takes on a bit of an English flavor for a little bit. What's happening in London then in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest, with the seizure of the throne by William and the kind of the next couple of decades, the disposition of much of the existing aristocracy and continued military conflicts, both in the north with the harrying, and then also there's the Scots get involved, the Danes get involved, the Irish get involved. What does London look like in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest?
Exactly the same as it did before. One of the really interesting things I picked up in studying the story of London is that this great pivotal moment, 1066, which is usually in any general history of England, is the start of a new chapter. In the tale of London, it's not even a full stop, it's a comma. London in 1067 is no more dramatically changed than London in 1017 when Canute took over. There are certain things that do immediately change. There's an occupational force, the same as had seen under Canute. This time, instead of it being Canute's 40 ships, it's effectively the Normans went in, and because it had been such a bastion of resistance, I believe one of the Norman witnesses said the city was filled with obstinate men who had been led by Ansgar. They built 2 fortresses straight away. I'd say they were motte and baileys, but there's a distinct lack of baileys, so they were mottes. 2 wooden fortresses, one at either end of the city. One would become the Tower of London. One would be located roughly where Old Bailey is located. These were force multipliers. It allowed a small body of Normans effectively pacify the city. Beyond that, Ansgar holds on to Portreeve for a couple of years before he loses the position. And that's handed over to Geoffrey de Mandeville, who becomes effectively William's governor of London. And this allows William to do whatever he does. But London was very smart and pragmatic. It had survived a Viking warlord called Canute taking over and opposing him, and had learned how you survive. And how you survive in a new regime is you just do exactly what you did with the Vikings. You go up and you offer them cash and you swear loyalty. And William took the cash and he gave them a charter of sorts, a basic 4-line charter that effectively said the rules that were in place before I was in charge are in place after. I won't disinherit any men or any children of their father's lands, and just a basic carry on as you go. And they actually did this in a very good sweet spot. The first year or so, I think, of William's reign, William actually hoped, I think, that he would be able to be Duke of Normandy and King of England, and everybody would be happy and everybody would work together. I think he honestly believed that. And right in that bubble of optimism, London goes up and says, "Can we have a charter?" And he gives them this. I mean, it is 4 lines, but it's enough. That means London basically gets loyal to William and starts following the status quo. There's money to be made. And so, one of the reasons you don't hear from London during this is London's got its head down. London is not really pushing the boat. I mean, it's so interesting that the story, did the Vanguardian Guard, was it all Anglo-Saxons who were leaving? One of the things that William did was disband the ship's field. So where did the ships go? Where did the ship's field go? That could well be the Vanguardian Guard. But it also makes this really interesting thing where the Normans effectively lost all sea power, and the Vikings of the North Scale diaspora took over the Irish Sea. But that's a separate one. What you see is during the invasions by the other claimants, because we go on about Hardrada and everything, but King Sven of Denmark claimed he should be king of England.
There's two accounts there that I can remember. One says that the fleet was scattered and didn't accomplish anything. The other one says that they landed but weren't able to really accomplish anything, as I recall.
Yeah, actually, what he actually did was in 1070, King Sven was paid off. William did a Danegeld, proper Danegeld. And it's really interesting because in 1070, King Sven of Denmark sails up the Thames to London to be met by William the Conqueror to be given a payoff. And what's really interesting, if you go back to 893, the similarities of Haston sailing up the Thames to meet Alfred the Great, to convert to Christianity, whatever. But yeah, so in 1070, the King Sven of Denmark actually turns up in London to meet William the Conqueror, to get given some gold and told that, bye, see ya. And so William could concentrate on everything else, and Sven dropped his entire campaign. So, and that's London facilitating. And London had always been the great facilitators of the Danegeld. This is where London's role really as a financial capital actually began with, London. I mentioned last episode how it was the monetary capital of England. It started building on that as the place where you organized Danegelds. And this then, London remained a major coin producing centre. William never once messed with the Saxon coin network of Edward, didn't mess with it at all. You still see the same Saxon coin makers making coins for William. London just carries on. The big change for London was the two fires, which I think were 1077 and 1087. And the two fires devastated the city. Everybody mentions the first fire about, this is where William brought in, or Geoffrey de Mandeville brought in, the curfew, the first ever mention of the word curfew, the curfew law, no fires after nightfall, to prevent a second fire happening, and the second fire did happen. But actually what was most important from the fire of 1077 was that they burnt down the mottes, and so the burning and rebuilding immediately afterwards, William and de Mandeville were able to effectively build stone castles. The one on one side of the city became the Tower of London, the White Keep, and opposite, bookending it, was Baynard's Castle. And behind that was Montfilcher's Castle. And so regardless of, London was all loyal, the Normans never fully trusted it because it was such a large body of humans. So they built 3 castles within the city to keep an eye on it. And so it's worth keeping that in mind. And then, by the time we get to Doomsday and everything, London has reconciled. London has come to terms with its role within the regime. And the problem was that in those 20 years, Geoffrey de Mandeville, governor of London, one of the top 10 richest people in the country, because after the Danes had robbed the Anglo-Saxon state blind, at this point, the Normans robbed the Anglo-Saxon state blind. And so by the time Doomsday comes up and the Doomsday Survey, which London isn't in, because somehow it avoided it. But what you do have is that London's economy has contracted enormously compared to where it had been under Edward and under Ethelred. And it was a shadow of what itself. It shattered. It was a doom. We say the Doomsday Survey. It was one of the things I mentioned in the podcast. It was an economic doomsday. London lost all of its dynamism, all of its power as a mercantile base. It was still a mercantile base, but it would not return to where it was in the 9th and 10th century until the 14th, 15th century. And that dark age really began with round about the latter part of William's era. So it just kept its head down and worked pragmatically.
I looked up the reference that I was thinking of. It was actually Canute IV's raids on England that I was thinking of. That's where the mix-up came about.
Yes, Canute IV. Yeah, he did, and I think there was another. I think there was about 5 or 6 claimants after Edward died. Especially in the Scandinavians, they were all tying into Gormsons. It went on for a while.
If you heard me clacking away, that was just me looking up the reference. Yeah, there's 2 competing accounts. One that says that the fleet landed, but they got kicked out by the Normans. The other one that says that the fleet got scattered and they paid William off, or whoever was king at that point. I'm not entirely sure if it was still William or not, to let them go home in peace.
Yes, I think I don't have that one. I knew about Sven because he ended up in London.
No. This one was along.
Are they in London? Yeah, I know it.
Yeah, no. This apparently happened along the west coast, up nearer Lincoln, York, that area. So when we're looking, sorry, and I could geek out on talking about the Norman Conquest and the Anglo-Saxon period literally all night. Like this is, and I'm gonna ask you for a list of references and sources that I need to be reading, because a lot of this information is new to me, and I like to think that this is my area of expertise, even if it's not specifically the city of London, but like this time period. When we're looking at London, then in the aftermath of the Norman Conquest, so it's got this economic contraction. I'm going to assume that it's not quite as devastating as the economic contraction of places like York, which don't do well under Norman rule, to put it mildly. There's a line in Odoric Vitalis. I forget exactly how it goes. Something along the lines of, "I've often praised William in this book, but I can't say anything good about this. God will judge him." Which I think is a pretty great line.
Yeah.
It was Malmesbury. I forget which one. Not that important. Moving on. So with this period of economic decline in London, and given the fact that the several Norman kings spend more of their time in Normandy than in England itself, what is going to be the way that London navigates this time period, especially after that we've got the first couple of Norman kings? You've got William, you've got Robert comes after him, right?
No, you go William first, William second, Henry first, Stephen.
This is how I can tell my knowledge of the time period ends at the Norman Conquest, because
I only know it from. Well, I will say this: as a historian like yourself, we have our specialisms. Mine was Tudor England, and I did quite a lot on the North scale Vikings. Since I started the Story of London, it's been fantastic for helping my chronological understanding of history. But that's only a side effect of it. And I often smile to myself and like, I finally work out the sequence of kings because of this damn podcast. But never mind. But yes, go on. Sorry.
No. It's fine. Like I said, my understanding here for the immediate aftermath, not great. Is it Willem Rufus? I was thinking maybe that's what I was thinking of. Rufus. Are close enough. And then you get to the anarchy, right, where you've got the Empress Matilda is supposed to be the heir, but Stephen of Blois comes in, and everybody has a great time. Not to be confused with the other Stephen of Blois, the one who went on crusade.
Captain Runaway. Um,
Yes.
it's really interesting because, again, the idea that parts of London from Saxon periods carry on during the early Norman period, very, very much so. And I think the anarchy is a crucial part of that. Right. The thing about the anarchy, it was the war between the two grandchildren of William the Conqueror. But where it ties into the story of London, and where, for me, it reinforces the point I made that 1066 was not a full stop even in London's history, is there's a moment that happens that harkens back to the Anglo-Saxon days as if nothing has happened. And that is something that when Stephen gives his charter to London, or Henry I gives his charter to London, and there's considerable debate about Henry I's charter to London, whether he did it or Stephen did it, and Londoners claimed it was given by Henry. But it mentions and it talks about the strange and peculiar right of of London, to choose its king. During the Anglo-Saxon period, you had seen London choose kings as a community. Harold I, the defiant stand alone in all of England to support Ethelred Unred, the choosing of Edmund Ironsides. London chose its kings. And that's the case of Stephen of Blois. When Henry I died, Matilda was slow off the mark. Stephen went straight away across to the Channel, crossed during a storm, which suited him, got into England, was not greeted warmly in Canterbury, and made his way to London. And there he sat down and met I will use the term oligarchs, but it's not that term, but it will just use it for a modern audience. He met the oligarchs of London and he cut a deal. And they would throw their support behind him as long as he recognized them as a commune, a self-governing community, which, interestingly enough, at the end of the anarchy, when the Commune of London is summoned to basically ratify and be part of the Treaty of Winchester, the rich men of London are referred to as, quote, almost nobles, unquote. And that was how London saw itself, the rare and peculiar right to choose their own king. They picked Stephen. They put Stephen, he was the king of London. And from there, he became king of England. And there's, I make a joke in the podcast. I point out that the actual laws of succession at the time were not based on primogeniture. Kings, since Edgar, no king had taken the throne without there being either conflict or usurpation. Not one. And in fact, no king would take the throne in line from their father as firstborn son until the reign of Richard I. And so Stephen usurping the throne was fine. The laws of succession in England were very simple. You had to take London, take Winchester and the treasury in Winchester, and get a crown put on your head in Westminster, preferably by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Although, Harold Godwinson couldn't do it, and couldn't get the Archbishop of York, so we had the Bishop of London do it. But apart from that, they were the four things you had to do, and that's what Stephen did. And so he became King of England. He gave London huge concessions from that. They were very happy in the deal. They stayed loyal to him. They stayed loyal to him all through his reign. They never broke rank. And so they supported him. The fundamental problem Stephen had, and this is where I try to point out to people that if you look at the geopolitical reality of Norman England, the capital of England was not London. The capital of England was Normandy. and Rouen. Whoever controlled Normandy would always be more important than whoever was sat in England in charge of the country. It's why Robert and Rufus had gone to war incessantly. It's why Henry and Robert had gone to war incessantly. And it is why fundamentally Stephen could not hold on to the throne. Apart from the first Battle of Lincoln, which he lost, he was effectively commander and in command of all of England. He was secure. He had an heir, Prince Eustace, who should have been king. He tried desperately to have him crowned as like under king as they did in France, but he fell out with the church and that couldn't happen. But he could not secure the throne because to the nobility of England, Normandy was more important. He who controlled Rouen controlled the state. And so even though London stayed fanatically loyal to Stephen, to the point of they defied Matilda when she turned up. I mean, it's a long, convoluted story because when she turned up, London was still willing to defy her. Stephen had been captured at the Battle of Lincoln. It was over. She was turning up on a procession. And Geoffrey de Mandeville, a descendant of Geoffrey de Mandeville, was in charge. The de Mandevilles run for about 4 generations, and they're quite a big thing in London's history. And one of them had been Stephen's right-hand man. And then when Stephen is captured, he goes over to Matilda. London resents him for that, but they're about to surrender when the other Matilda, or Maud, Stephen's wife, raises an army with a mercenary captain called William of Ypres and Kent and starts marching towards London. And London go, right, let's get Matilda. And they ring the bells of London and they surge out in a mob to ransack Westminster. Matilda has to run. And you see it afterwards. London was very committed to Stephen's fight all through the anarchy siege of Oxford, a couple of other sieges. They get very strongly involved. The destruction of Winchester, the great rivalry during Saxon times between Winchester and London. London win that rivalry by turning up and sacking the place, robbing it blind and walking off whistling. And so they were this incredible power during Stephen's reign. And it's only afterwards that, who runs Normandy? Henry of Anjou. And so they agree that upon his death, Eustace will be disinherited and Henry will become king and he becomes Henry II. And London bows its head and Henry does exactly what his mother was going to do, which is rip up commune status and remind them, no, I'm in charge. So London was like, oh,
Eustace died shortly afterwards anyways.
Yes, yeah, that very convenient death. Very, very convenient death. But yeah, so this is really where, you see that Londoners had almost the zenith of power under Stephen. And the power to choose him and to back him hearkened unto the Anglo-Saxon days. They do not really exercise it again until John, where they kind of do with the invitation to Prince Louis to become King of England, which London does. They invite over the Dauphin of France to become king. And they invite him, set him up, proclaim him king in St. Paul's. So that old Anglo-Saxon right, that peculiar right of London, runs right up for quite some time. And it's very interesting to see.
All right. Well, so I know we are jumping around in history a good bit. We spent so long on 1065, and now we're on through to the anarchy. I don't want to spend. I know currently in the podcast, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're in the War of the Roses, right?
I'm just coming up to the War of the Roses. Yeah, I'm literally just starting it.
For those of us who are a little bit less up to date with our English historical terminology or time periods, that's roughly the late 15th century. So looking
14th, 15th. We're halfway through the 15th century right now.
There we go.
1455.
And I will say that rather than try and sum up the War of the Roses in simple, digestible, compact manner, which I'm not sure is possible to do.
No, I don't think it is.
Yeah, there's no real way to go through that in an easy way. We can kind of leave the story of London there and encourage our audience that if they want the rest of the story, starting with the Plantagenets, you mentioned the ascension of Henry II and all of the wonderful things that happened with his reign and the reign that comes shortly after, the reigns that come shortly after his. I think we're going to go ahead and kind of put a cap on that just because we want to encourage people to go and listen to your podcast as well. We don't want them to just listen to us to get the whole history of London.
Yeah, and
so
I will say just in terms of that, one of the things is I'll send you the sources, but I do discuss in a lot more detail where I get a lot of the things I'm saying. I'm aware sometimes when I say things, people go, "Where do you get that from?" The podcast when I cover, there's I think I spend about 2 hours just talking about 1066 alone, the year of three kings, which was actually the year of four kings, but I changed the title because it was more stylized. There's things within the story that I could spend hours talking, and the London's crucial role in the Magna Carta. London was the driving force behind the First Barons' War, in no uncertain terms, driving force behind the writing of the Magna Carta. You see it in other things like the endless fights with Richard II, who is just an appalling king from London's point of view, leading to the Second Barons' War. Their clashes, the Edwards, the Plantagenets really didn't like London, and London really knew they had to get in with the Plantagenets, but didn't like it. And, it's following that saga. And I mean, we spent an hour here talking. If I'm going to be blunt, if you start the podcast on episode 1 and played it through, I think I make about 5 days unbroken. There's a lot. And I'm only up to the 1450s. I'm going to be here for a while. But it has been a joy. And discovering, little things like the rise and fall of the Jewish community of London, the medieval Jewish community of London, the economic history of medieval London, which is stunning and also very repetitive. I think I'm going to have trauma from talking about wool staples, compulsory wool markets, because that was a big thing. The rise of the livery companies, all these things all tie in with things such as the 100 Years' War. London's basically paying for the garrison at Calais for years because it was a wool market. And as well as that, you've got the wonderful and never-ending regulations of the city, which cover everything from gutters to the sex trade. And it's been a joy to do. And that's why, I'm so pleased and honored that you asked me to talk about it. And I would happily talk about it forever.
we might do, maybe we'll do a belated part 3 at some point. I've got several episodes in the pipeline right now. But I would love to have you back on and just talk about it. I'm going to have to check out your podcast a little bit more just because it's such a fascinating period of history that I wish I knew more about, and there are ways to rectify that situation.
Oh, thank you. If anybody does want to listen and ask questions, I mean, I'm on Blue Sky, but I'm more than happy. I love getting responses from people and questions, especially about things like, the creation of the livery companies, the creation of the first mayor, and the story behind that, held power for 20 odd years. And, by all accounts, he does seem to have been a family of Saxon survivors who survived all through the Norman period until one of their descendants becomes, Henry Fitzaylwin, the first mayor of London, and what that meant. And all these things all tie in. So, yeah, it's enormous fun, and it's very rewarding, and it's just an insight into English history that is slightly off key. And that's where I'm really enjoying it, because it does look at things from the city's point of view. So they don't think too much of, everybody loves Richard I. London didn't.
we'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.